Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Spence webinar for employers in the local government pension schemes. My name's Alistair Russell-Smith and I lead the practice at Spence for charities and not-for-profits. I'll be chairing the session this afternoon. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues Rachel Graham and Sean Campbell. They're both in the practice too and fresh from having done lots of work for employers in the sector on the sorts of options and opportunities that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So why are we talking about this now? There's two reasons. First reason is that for the Scottish local government pension funds, the triennial valuation results were issued recently within the last few months, and that's going to lead to a reset of the employer contribution rates payable from the 1st of April. So now is a really sensible time to be thinking about your LGPS options. But secondly, and perhaps more pertinently, LGPS funding is as high as we've seen it in really quite some time. For years, sort of, you've probably thought about your LGPS exposure as a liability, but actually in many cases it's now an asset. So it's opening up some new interesting opportunities for employers in the funds that will run through too, and potentially accessing a surplus and a payment back from the fund. We've got about 30 minutes of material that Rachel, Sean and myself will run you through. So we'll do that, but if you've got any questions as we're going, just please ask away. You can see the question box there. Fear not, they only come to the three of us, so you can ask whatever question you like. We'll pick it up as we go or at the end, or failing that, we'll come back to you afterwards. So I've introduced the three of us. Let's just move on to what we'll be discussing today. So I'm going to hand over to Sean any second. He's just going to run you through the LGPS landscape in Scotland and bring a bit more detail to that improvement in funding position that I've been talking about. We'll then hear from Rachel, who's going to run us through. There's quite a bit of jargon and different language that's used in local government pension scheme funding. So she's going to run you through that, the different ways to measure the liabilities, the different types of contributions, and then explain this opportunity around exit. And then I'll just wrap up with what your options are and what you should be thinking about now as an employer ahead of that contribution reset on the 1st of April. So, Sean, what's going on in LGPS land in Scotland?
Thanks, Alistair. So this slide here sets the scene for much of what we're going to cover in the presentation. The table shows the funding level for the 11 LGPS funds across Scotland at the 2020 actuarial valuation date. The results shown are on a prudent or cautious basis, referred to in most of the reports you'll have seen as the ongoing basis. As you can see, the funding level across all funds at 2020 was relatively good, with the funding levels all over 90% on the ongoing basis. In aggregate, across all the funds, the funding level was 104%. The more prudent or cautious a basis is, the higher your resulting liabilities will be for the fund. And at the 2020 valuation date, the Government Actuaries Department estimated that the aggregate funding level on a best estimate basis or a less cautious basis was 129%. So the next few slides set out the changes in market conditions over recent times and the implications for the LGPS funds in Scotland, which is ultimately a further significant improvement in the funding level at the 2023 valuation date. So the chart on screen shows the return of a few different asset classes since 31 March 2020. The top two purple and blue lines represent global equities and UK equities. As the chart shows, these assets have had very strong returns since 2020, increasing by up to 50% by 31 March 2023. So any funds with a considerable holding in equities are likely to have seen a significant rise in their assets at 31 March 2023, all else being equal. The bottom green line represents index-linked bonds. As you can see, they have had contrasting returns since 31 March 2020 compared to equities, reducing by approximately 35%. The next slide will add a bit more detail to this, but liabilities are broadly linked to gilts or interest rates. There's been a significant reduction in the overall fund liabilities. These two combined effects, an increase in assets, assuming they're broadly in line with equities, and a reduction in liabilities, assuming they're broadly linked to gilts and interest rates, has led to funding level improvements of approximately 30 to 40% between 2020 and 2023. So the chart on the next slide we have here shows the change in gilt yield since 2008. As you can see, there has been quite a dramatic change in gilt yields, especially over the last 2 to 3 years, where we have gone from gilt yields of roughly 0.5% in 2020 to rates of about 4.5% more recently. What we're also seeing with the current market conditions is gilt yields back to levels seen pre-2007, 2008 financial crisis, and they're arguably back at a more normalized long-term level. So what does this mean for your pension scheme? Gilt yields are predominantly used in the derivation of your discount rate assumption. So when gilt yields rise and the discount rate subsequently increases, all else being equal, this will act to reduce the value of your scheme liabilities. So putting this all together, on the next slide, we have an illustration of how we expect funding levels to have moved from 2020. So as touched on earlier, the funding level for LGPS schemes in Scotland was around 100% on an ongoing basis in 2020. Since then, we have seen an increase in assets, such as equities, increasing the value of your scheme assets, and an increase in gilt yields, reducing the value of your scheme liabilities, such that we would expect funds to be sitting with funding levels closer to 130 or possibly even 140% now on an ongoing basis. So that's a very quick overview of the last few years and where we expect funding levels to be sitting at the current date.
Great, thanks, Sean. Actually, let's just take a question that's come in that's linked to this bit. So, question about ongoing contribution levels in Scottish funds and the new contributions coming in 1st of April. What sort of contribution ranges are we seeing, Sean?
Kind of varies between the different funds. So in some cases, employer contributions are being reduced down to about 7%, I think it is, to match employee contributions for the next 2 years. In other cases, funds are still offering a reduction to the contributions for employers, but they're still in the region of around 20%. So there's still quite a range across the different funds.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Sean. Thank you. And also, it's important to understand the levers that influence those contribution rates and what impact they have. There are things like the time horizon, the funding target, probability of success, all impacts on the contribution rates you actually pay. So it's worth understanding that with your fund. Okay, let's move on to some of this lingo and different terminology. Rachel, how do we measure the liabilities?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. So your organisation's liabilities in the fund are measured on a variety of different funding bases, and you might have seen some of the terminology on the slide here when you've been reading through the valuation reports that have come through from the fund. The ongoing basis, this is the triennial actuarial valuation basis, and legislation requires this to be quite a prudent basis. The expected return on scheme assets will be taken into account when setting the discount rate to use. And this is the basis that's used to calculate the future pension contributions, assuming continuing participation in the fund. On the other hand, the FRS 102 accounting basis, it's used each year to assess pension liabilities for accounting purposes and is calculated using a prescribed basis set by the accountancy profession. It'll use a discount rate based on good quality, usually A-rated corporate bonds of an equivalent duration to the scheme's liabilities. And currently, this basis is likely to be similar in strength to the ongoing basis, thereby resulting in quite a similar level of liabilities and deficit. As this valuation is undertaken each year, the results can be quite volatile. Finally, the cessation basis. This is the basis that's used by the fund to calculate your liabilities, assuming you exit the fund. It is a very prudent basis. Discount rate used often removes any allowance for asset outperformance over gilts. The discount rate is typically set based on the gilt yield at the date of exit. Hence, the liabilities measured on this basis are usually much higher than the value of the liabilities on an ongoing or an FRS basis. It's worth understanding, just in terms of guarantees, it's worth understanding whether or not you have a guarantee in place from your council, as this could actually be quite valuable. A guarantee changes a few aspects of how your liabilities are measured in the fund. If you have a guarantee in place, your ongoing funding position will be calculated using a more favourable ongoing basis, which is less prudent than the ongoing basis that would be used by the fund for an employer with no guarantee. And if you have a guarantee in place, that favourable ongoing basis would be used by the fund to calculate your exit liabilities, and any surplus above that guarantee level would be refunded to the employer. Whereas if you don't have a guarantee from your council, your exit liabilities will be calculated on the very prudent cessation basis, and you're more likely to have a surplus on your ongoing basis in comparison to your cessation basis. But it is still possible to obtain a surplus even if you don't have a guarantee, if your cessation funding position turns out to be positive. Just on to the next slide, then the slide here, we look at the contributions that your organisations pay to the fund, and they're made up of three different components. Again, you might recognise some of the references here on the slide from your recent valuation results, of course, that the fund would have sent you. The primary contributions, this is the annual contribution rate that is required to fund future pension accrual for active members. Secondary contributions, this is the contribution rate required to fund any past service deficit, and given the significant recent improvement in funding levels on an ongoing basis, it's likely that this secondary contribution rate might be nil or negative for a number of organisations. Exit contributions, this is the deficit on a cessation basis payable when your organisation ceases to have any active members, or payable when your organisation leaves the fund. Some organisations we've worked with recently have exited the fund and have had an exit credit as they were in surplus on a cessation basis. On this slide then, we've looked at potential timing of exiting the fund. So your organisation may be one that is considering exiting the fund given the favourable improvements in funding levels that we've seen recently. We're seeing funding levels on an exit or cessation basis at their highest levels in years. We have recently supported organisations through an exit process whereby the value of their liabilities on an exit basis was lower than their share of the fund's assets, and this resulted in them receiving an exit credit payment from the fund rather than being faced with an unaffordable exit deficit as we've seen for some organisations in the past. Funding levels can be extremely volatile depending on how financial markets move in the future. We could see deficits on an exit basis emerging again at some stage in the future. You might therefore wish to consider the timing of an exit from the fund if exiting is part of your organisation's objectives, or if you happen to have a falling number of active members currently in the scheme. Alistair, I'll hand back to you at that point.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And actually, let's just take another question that's come in that's relevant here. So, question about surpluses. What sort of surplus payments are we seeing back from funds for our clients?
Recently, even over the last year, we've seen a range of different levels of surplus refunds from funds, some in the region of a couple of £100,000, for example, right up to a recent one that we've seen of £2 million. So in some cases, these have been quite significant.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Rachel. I mean, a lot of these employers as well, a lot of the employers we work with are sometimes smaller charities and not-for-profits where these are very material sums relative to their own income and balance sheets.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the background. Moving on to sort of what can you as an employer do about it? What are your options? We've got 4 options on screen here, so just taking you through each of these. Option 1 is carry on. So carry on participating in the fund. You probably are on that sort of inevitable time horizon to exiting if you've got a closed group of staff in the fund. But you can just carry on. In the short term, you should see a saving in cash costs, which is good news. We touched on this earlier. We're seeing the contribution rates range anywhere from sort of 7% employer rates up to 20% plus. So understanding that and where necessary challenging that if you're wanting to adjust those contributions is worth looking at. But the big issue with carrying on, or the big risk, is you are exposed to that future funding volatility. So local government pension scheme assets are not particularly matched to the liabilities. So you do see volatility in funding levels. I mean, that's why we've got this really strong funding position at the moment, but there's obviously a risk that might reverse in the future, and you exit at a time when the funding is not as strong. So you're then into options 2 and 3, which is actually deciding to proactively exit. We'll come on the next slide to how you do that. You do need to take your remaining actives out of the pension scheme, which requires a process in itself. But if you do that and you exit, you'll either be in a deficit or a surplus on that cessation basis, and therefore going down either option 2 or option 3 respectively on the screen. So if you're in a deficit and exit debt, option 2, one helpful thing that some of the funds are doing is providing a guaranteed quote that they'll stand by for 60 days. This is really helpful. It removes one of those issues that employers have grappled with historically, which is how do I make a decision to exit when I don't actually know what the cost will be, because I only know what the cost is after I've exited and it's crystallized. So getting those guaranteed quotes up front is really helpful and will help you with your decision making. In most cases, typically funds will want employers to pay that debt up front as a lump sum. So that tends to be the default, but if that is an issue, certainly from an affordability perspective, there are other options to think of and be aware of. So the first one there is a deferred spreading arrangement. This is where you still exit the fund, you crystallize that position now, locking in arguably what's a pretty favorable funding position, but rather than paying that deficit up front, you can spread the payments over time. So this is worth looking at if affordability for paying the whole thing up front is an issue. The funds may sometimes need security or want security to do this if it's available, particularly for longer spreading periods. That's worth looking at. The last one then is called a deferred debt arrangement. So that's a nuance on this. You don't actually exit under this arrangement. You cease accrual, but you don't crystallize your exit position. You carry on participating as an ongoing employer, paying those secondary contributions if necessary that Rachel talked about, and then you exit in the future, hopefully when that funding position is improved and that exit debt is lower. Although clearly the risk with this approach is, like option 1, that doesn't happen and the position is worse in the future rather than better. But what we're actually seeing for a lot of employers now is they're tripping into option 3, so they're in surplus on a cessation basis. So what do you need to think about there if you're in that situation? Well, you can access that cessation surplus. It's very clear in Scottish LGPS funds in particular. As an employer, you get a refund of that amount back. You do need the remaining active employees to leave the fund and get a replacement pension provision. So we are seeing some employers develop some win-win scenarios where you use some of that surplus that's coming back to enhance the pension benefits for affected staff and soften the blow of that pension change. So as an example, with the agreement of the funds, you can buy extra years pension benefit in the local government pension scheme for those members, effectively pre-funding some of the pension that they'd otherwise lose out on. And the other thing to really watch out for and look into the detail on is that actual exit policy. There are a range of different approaches being used by the funds. Whilst a cessation on a gilts basis was quite common historically, which gave you quite a clear, simple line on am I in surplus or not. Some funds are now using alternative approaches, things like stochastic approaches, in some cases cessation corridors. So these are tending to actually make it a bit more difficult to access surpluses. So do watch out for that. Understand what your policy, what the policy is for your fund, and what the timescales might be for any review of that policy as well. The last option, which we then wanted to mention, which it's a new one, so it's being talked about. There haven't really been many implementations yet, but again, worth being aware of and discussing with your fund if it's relevant to you, is what's called partial cessation. So this is where you settle your position and your obligation for the deferreds and pensioners in the scheme, but you remain participating for your actives. So the key benefit of this is that it does not disturb the pension benefits of your current employees. So if changing the pension benefits is just too problematic from an HR recruitment and retention perspective, then this is an interesting option. You don't disturb the benefits, but what you do is you settle the position for all the former employees. Typically 50-60% of your liabilities relate to members that are no longer employed by your organisation. So you can effectively shrink the size of the risk for yourself, potentially access an exit credit in relation to those people, and just carry on participating in a far lower risk way for those active members. So they're the main options. Like I said, for options 2 and 3, you do need to remove the existing employees from the pension fund, from the LGPS, and find an alternative pension provision for them. A lot of employers do have alternative pension provision set up, often DC, defined contribution. But when we work with employers, we typically use this 4-stage process that you can see on screen now for managing that change with staff. So just walking you through this. Stage 1, develop your proposal to the affected staff. A key thing here is the contractual position. So is LGPS hard-coded in employment contracts, for example, in which case you may well need the agreement of staff for the change, or, as is often the case, is the obligation in the employment contract just to provide a pension rather than specifically a local government pension scheme. So understand that, because that drives the process, the communication process you'll have with the affected staff. And then develop that initial proposal for the affected staff. So there's clearly pension. The starting point for that may well be the existing DC provision that your other employees have. But do also think about some of the non-pension benefits. So just looking at the last box there, LGPS does provide life cover, which would be lost on an exit. So look to replicate that through a group life policy. LGPS does also offer ill health early retirement, and again, benefits can be substituted or replicated there through insured policies such as income protection. So think about the non-pension bits as well. And then also a kind of easy win here is to introduce salary sacrifice. This is not possible in local government pension schemes, but is absolutely standard in DC schemes, and a lot of employers are probably already operating this. But this is a mechanism whereby you exchange your pension contribution as an individual for a lower salary in exchange for the employer putting that same amount into the pension scheme. And as a result of that, both you and your employer save national insurance. So it's a zero cost way to increase net pay for staff or increase the amount they save into pension. So get that proposal developed. We normally suggest that takes about two weeks. And once you've done that, then that drives stage 2, which is the communications with staff. There is a question whether a consultation is needed. Local government pension schemes do not fall under the usual pension consultation requirements for private sector schemes, but in many cases it's still best practice to follow that certainly the principles of that consultation process. So make sure you have some material for the affected staff, clearly explaining the proposal, what impact it has on them. And what's really important in our experience is having a clear business case for that change, because if the affected individuals can understand why you as an organisation are proposing this change, even if they don't like it from a personal perspective, it helps if they can see the rationale for that change from a broader business or charity perspective. We also find it's helpful to, just rather than just having written communication, to actually present face-to-face, ideally with staff, so that they can understand what's going on and hear you say it directly, hear your advisor say it directly, and get an opportunity to ask questions live. And the last thing we quite often do is personalised illustrations. So these are illustrations that set out someone's pension pre and post the proposed change. So it's a really clear way for affected employees to understand what impact this proposal has on them. And quite often this can be helpful for demonstrating that this change may not be as bad as staff first feared. For example, if you're if you're actually quite close to retirement, you've already accrued a lot of your pension, then this doesn't actually have that much impact on your pension. So run those staff communications, and then at the end of that process, make your final decision on what the change will be and any refinements you might want to make to that change. So we do see employers sometimes offering some refinements to their initial proposal at the end, or as they go through the consultation, and some of the examples you can see on screen. So access to a financial advisor, for example, possibly enhancing the DC contributions relative to what other employees get for a period of time. I've touched on using that surplus in the fund to buy added years in LGPS for affected staff. And one other quite neat thing is, again, for people that are closer to retirement, over 60, potentially got the rule of 85 in local government pension scheme, might actually be in their interest to start drawing their pension. They get the most value from their LGPS pension there. And of course, by doing that, they also exit the scheme, which is helpful for getting this change through. So you make those refinements, communicate those with staff, and then you implement, which is phase 4, which, to be honest, is fairly straightforward. You need to liaise with the fund, the DC provider, and payroll, and then it's done. So you can see, sort of end to end, we recommend taking about 3 to 4 months for implementing this sort of proposal if you're interested in looking at exiting your LGPS fund and in many cases accessing a surplus payment. So just to draw this all together, just the sort of takeaways about the stuff we've been talking about. I'm sure you've heard us say this time and time again now, but LGPS funding levels really are at the highest level we've seen in living memory, I think. So there really is an opportunity to assess your options now and think about, should I be triggering an exit now rather than sort of leaving it uncontrolled and having an exit forced on me when my last active leaves the fund. The exit credit, if you are in that position, you've got that surplus, think about using that and some of the win-win solutions we've talked about there to implement the change and mitigate any loss on affected staff. And that partial cessation option is an interesting one and worth thinking about if making the change is too problematic for your employees. And like I say, 3 to 4 month timescale to implement that exit. So that's everything from us. I hope that was useful. Let's just take some questions. We'll take a few, but we won't take up too much of your time. So one that's come in is on those changes and sort of sweeteners that we're seeing employers offer. Rachel, what sort of sweeteners have you seen employers offering?
Just thinking, I suppose we've seen quite a range. We have seen some employers not offer anything.
Yeah.
We've seen other employers offer, maybe it's the alternative arrangement that members would be being put into as a DC arrangement, maybe offering for the first few years of their participation in that DC fund a higher contribution initially, and then that dropping off back down to the level that is offered for all of the other DC members. We have seen also in 1 or 2 cases where employers have offered to compensate members by putting a one-off lump sum into their DC pots for them. Where we've been involved in looking at what would be in a lump sum that would be equivalent to the benefit that they might have built up in the DB fund for the next maybe 3 to 5 years, for example. So quite a range, ranging from no incentive at all to quite large one-off lump sums in cases.
Yeah, and it's that contractual position that drives a lot of that as well, isn't it? So whether or not the staff have a contractual entitlement to LGPS, you definitely need to have more generous alternatives in place for employees that are in that situation. Okay, we'll take one more. So Sean, question for you. Someone's saying that they're not sure where to start with all of this, and what's the sort of best way to tackle this and understand the options?
I think you can come to us as a starting point. We can kind of help and kind of advise you along the way, I would say, as such. But if not, you can go to your fund, get in contact with the fund itself, and start the conversations with them around what you need to do and to kind of get this progressing. But then another useful thing to probably look at is your most recent cessation valuation that you've had done, and that might give you a steer as to where you might be sitting in terms of hopefully an exit surplus on your cessation basis. You'll get that credit back, or if you are still in a deficit, you might need to pay a debt. So that would probably be the kind of best places to start. But like I say, we can always sit on your shoulder essentially and help you progress this forward if you need that additional support and advice.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Sean. We're really happy to have a conversation with people and have a look at the options for you at a high level. And I guess one other piece of information that will be coming out fairly soon is the March 24 FRS position. So that's an easy way to look at some current numbers for you if you participate in the fund and have a 31st of March year end. Great, we'll leave it there. I hope everyone has enjoyed that webinar and found it helpful. As is probably obvious, please do get in touch with us if you've got any questions or follow up, or you'd like to understand your situation and what your options might be. We'll leave you to enjoy the rest of your afternoon. That's bye from all of us. And thank you, Rachel and Sean.
Thank you.